On behalf of the National Public Housing Museum, we thank you for tuning in to our oral history audio listening series, Out of the Archives. In each episode, we will share a diverse range of stories told by public housing residents from our oral history archive. In this episode, Pressure and Time Makes Diamonds, we celebrate Black History Month with a selection of narrators sharing a range of their complex experiences living in public housing in New York City. The narrators in this episode include Jayah Arnett, Bonnette Bryant, Domingo Morales, and Pamela Phillips, all of whom have lived or are currently living in the Bronx and Manhattan. These stories span from 1958 to the present day. Meet Bonnette Bryant, whose story was recorded in 2021. Bonnette lived in the George Washington Carver homes in Harlem, Manhattan from 1958 to 1983. In this clip, she talks about her husband, NBA basketball player M. Bryant, and his summer clinics he held for young NYCHA residents, as well as her own experience working as a camp counselor at youth center La Casita Maria. She goes on to share instances where she met young people while counseling who would later become movers and shakers in the entertainment industry.
Bonnette Bryant. My husband used to, the year I'm 67, when I met my husband, I didn't know that he was a professional basketball player until I came home and saw his face on the back of the New York Post. Well, my mother was just smitten. She thought it was a great thing. But he used to bring a lot of the ball players, they used to do clinics in the playgrounds, all up and down all the projects. You know, Emmett used to do all these basketball clinics, and he had, Kareem Abdul, Tiny Archibald, Marvin Roberts, Nate Bowman, Freddie Crawford. He had all these different guys. So even some from the Harlem Globetrotters, they would come and do these clinics and pass out T-shirts and sneakers and basketballs. And the kids used to just go crazy, we did that. He did that for 2 summers straight. And then I went off to nursing school after that. Oh, but I remember one of my first jobs as counselors was when I was in college, because I was on college work study. I got a grant where I could work at Casita Maria Community Center, and that was another housing project between Madison Avenue and Park Avenue. And so, it was, it had a lot of Latino, it was a very heavily Latino population. So they call it La Casita Maria. And I was, for about 3 years, I was their camp counselor. And one of the kids that I counseled was Mark Anthony. He was like 7 years old, so he was one of my day camp kids. And also I met Jennifer Lopez back in those days. She was when we would go to the Bronx to the swimming pool there, and she was I met her at one of the community centers. They were putting on a talent show. And my kids from Casita Maria was at this. They had a Bronx Casita Maria, so we would get together the 2 centers, and that's how I met Jennifer Lopez. So she was a little girl at that time, and she was spectacular. She was unbelievable. So it's been just going around to all these different community centers, and as a camp counselor, it was very enlightening, because I met a lot of kids who turned out to be either musicians or actors and actresses. That was unbelievable.
We met our next narrator, Jayah Arnett, through her My Project Runway storytelling platform, which highlights NYCHA's resident stories with a photograph from the storyteller. Jayah also currently lives at the George Washington Carver homes in Harlem, Manhattan, and shares about how she has found pride in living in her community and how they look after each other.
Jayah Arnett. One of my fonder memories is learning about my community, and like when you're young, you don't know if you're rich or poor. You just kind of like live somewhere and you take it for what it is. So I feel like when I started to realize that public housing was seen as like the more poor places in New York City, or like just of lower everything, like lower education, lower in like the poverty status, like I started to take that in and internalize it and try to make something different of it. That specific moment where I found out that like we're not seen as the other parts of New York City, like downtown, is when someone asked me like, "Oh, do you live in the brown brick buildings in New York City?" And I was so happy to say yes, and like somebody made me feel terrible for saying that. So that's one of my memories where I remember like starting to really come to terms with like, oh, I live in public housing. I started to be like embarrassed from like the ages of 13 to I would say like 20. I was super embarrassed to like tell people where I lived. Um, like I wouldn't want people to drop me off in front of my building, like if they were driving me home. Like it was something that I really tried to avoid and I was upset about for a while, until I went to college and I realized that like public housing is a part of my story and who I am. And if I wasn't from this community, I probably wouldn't be the person that I am today. So it was really like a turning point for me when I started to feel those like embarrassing feelings. Um, and before like that experience, I was like just seeing it as some place I lived. I didn't think too deep into it. But like I said, as you get older, like you start to realize things and understand things in a different way than you did before. When you come from New York City, I feel like there's people in your community, especially in your building complexes, um, that do everything. So we had like an icy lady on the second floor, and every summer, like we would go knock on her door and buy ices for 50 cents. And then the person who would braid my hair, she didn't live in my complex, but she lived in a complex a couple blocks away, and my mom had become very good friends with her, where my mom would take us and we would always me and my sister would get our hair braided with her. Um, the complex in general is like very family orientated. So despite whether like someone sold candy or made food here, it's always been like a family vibe. There's even an experience where the woman from upstairs came and knocked on my door not too long ago, and she needed like a little assistance with money and like food, and my mom was able to help her in that aspect because she knew that she could come downstairs and ask. So I think that like when you come from public housing, especially in New York City, because I can speak for growing up in New York, if you see the same people every day and you talk to them and you build the community, then people look out for you and they want to share what it is they do and make sure that they can provide whatever they need to assist you in the life that you live.
Our next narrator, Domingo Morales, lived in public housing from 1992 through 2018. He lived in the Patterson Project and Soundview houses in the Bronx, but spent the majority of his time in the Woodrow Wilson houses in East Harlem, Manhattan. He echoed Jayah's reflections about community within public housing, but also complicated how widespread that sense of community is.
Domingo Morales, one big family. And that's the difference between now and I think today, when I like visit my family members who still live in NYCHA, is there used to be this family sense where like we all live in the same building. You look after each other's kids, you see something odd in the building, you take care of it. You know, we weren't really big on calling the cops, but if we saw something that was fishy in the building, the champions of the neighborhood, you know, those people that were always around, would step to that person like, hey, what are you doing here? This looks funny. Go do that somewhere else. So I just feel like my neighbors were really cared about me, my brothers and my sisters, because we were all from the same building. But that being said, you could have like a building right across the street that really hates the people in the opposite building. So you have some neighbors that really cared about us, and always, like, if they saw us late for school, they would tell our mom, like, your kid was late for school, running around, you need to check on your kid. But then there's also like another side of it where the adults always had these issues with each other. And, you know, we had gangs and different disagreements, people, you know, dating other people's wives and things like that. So there's this system where certain buildings don't talk to each other. Like, don't talk to me, don't walk past my building. I don't care about your kids. I don't care about those people. So it was like a real, like, territorial thing whenever you're in the hood, is you can be in the same development. And when I say development in New York City, every, you know, public housing development has a different name for a certain amount of buildings. So like 5 buildings put together through the course of a couple blocks would be called, you know, Wilson houses. So like, you could be in the same development, the same chain of buildings, but one building next to each other hate each other. So there were some buildings, some neighbors that I stayed away from, because all I saw from them were like violence, and they really didn't like any of the adults in my building. So the adults in my building would tell me, like, stay away from them. So there was a lot of that, like a lot of family village style thinking. But, you know, also there's other villages in this public housing development that you have to be careful of. So that's really what it was to me. I always felt safe in my building. But once I left my building, I always knew, like, all right, it's a free fall. You got to be able to hold your own. And you learn that pretty quickly growing up in the hood. Is you can't let people step over you, and you have to know how to, like, hold your ground and be aware of your surroundings so you don't get caught by surprise.
Domingo also spoke about the wintertime and the joys and struggles of dealing with cold weather while living in public housing. His reflections led to deeper insights about safety, basic psychological needs, and the systemic neglect of public housing infrastructure. These systemic issues combine to form a tinderbox of conditions leading to tragedies like the recent January 9th, 2022 fire at the Twin Parks Northwest Complex in the Bronx.
There was one winter, maybe, what was it, back in 1998, I think. I was young, but I remember this. There was a blizzard, and that blizzard was so high that I think the snow, after the snow blowers came through the community, the snow was like up almost at the first floor window of the NYCHA building. Like, that's how high the snow was. And I remember that day it was freezing and we had no heat, like no heat at all. It was freezing. We were inside, my fingers were numb, my feet were numb. And there was a resident on the first floor who, like, took their window guard off the window, and they were, like, letting kids jump out of the window into the snow. So we all went downstairs. It's freezing in the house. So it's like, if I'm freezing, I might as well play in the snow anyway, right? So all the kids from the building would go into this neighbor's apartment, and we would jump in through the window and, like, landing in the snow, like doing snow angels. And it was just so fun to do that. But what I remember was, like, getting back upstairs, and my fingers were freezing, my toes were freezing, my ears were freezing. And I remember, like, oh my God, we're gonna freeze tonight. And then in my house, we really didn't have any quilts. So it was those thin blankets. That's all we had. So we would, like, wrap our jackets around our feet and then put the blanket over our jackets just to conserve some heat. But that day, it was so cold in the house that when we got home, my mother opened the oven, and she bust the oven open, cranked it on full heat, and left it open for hours, like hours. And the reason why I bring up this story is because it shows, like, we weren't living in the conditions where we should have, right? We should have had heat. You pay rent, even if it's a reduced rent because you're in a program, you still pay rent. You still live in this apartment. And we had no heat. And because we had no heat, my mother was forced to, like, burn fossil fuels for 6 hours so we could survive through the night.
Pamela Phillips, the last narrator of this episode, succinctly describes the discrepancy of experiences between public housing residents in different generations.
My name is Pamela Phillips. In order to handle now this newborn and my daughter, I applied to public housing immediately. It didn't take me long to get in. I'd say about 6 months or so. So around December of 1999, I moved into Marble Hill houses and stayed there for 18 years, raising my kids, and it was a good experience, but it was a different experience from what I had when I was coming up in public housing, because, you know, like, just not just a borough, like every borough has their own little culture, but also, you know, public housing itself had begun to change a bit from the community that I knew coming up to what it was morphing into as I was raising my kids in public housing. So I stayed because, you know, provided me with opportunity, right? I was able to do things in public housing, and I knew that from coming up with my mom that I probably wouldn't be able to do out in the private market, because rents were always out of my reach, right? Like, you know, we had commas in our rents up there for a long time. And I just, you know, like, I just didn't feel like it was something I could handle. So I stayed, but let me go back to Manhattanville, because that's the glory years for me, right? You know, growing up, and I try not to. I talk about my time in Manhattanville often, but the more I talk about it, I try not to romanticize, right? My whole experience, because, you know, when you think back, it's not always, you kind of tend to forget about, you know, any bad stuff that you went through. And I didn't really go through anything bad, but I just want to recognize that we had our problems. I can't emphasize enough, you know, that for my particular family, I feel as though, and I could probably speak to others, that public housing, the space that it created, allowed for such community and upward mobility. Like, for me, I took that with me, because I watched some people just come up, you know, from DJing in the park to, what, you got a record coming out? You know, like, we had a neighborhood where, you know, everybody was rapping at the time. So, you know, you just watched people be creative, and, you know, the thing now is, oh, for life, you know, like, when you come through the hood, it's like, yo, 1470 for life, or, you know, 1430 for life. And I'm like, no. But I get where they're coming from. You know what I'm saying? Like, for life, meaning this is always going to be a part of you. You know, we always going to be family. Anytime we come through family days, what people be planning their vacations, you know, to come back to that environment and experience, you know, some of that community and good feeling. And when you see them, it's just, the memories just come flooding back, you know, and you're sitting there, you know, you might be drinking a beer, or we ain't supposed to, but you know what I'm saying. You know, just hanging out and talking about the good old days, But one of the, you know, that was my experience coming up. But my kids' experience was so different. And it hit me when I started doing work around housing and public housing. And I was talking to one of my collaborators and, started talking about those good old days. Oh, the good old days. And she was like, because she was younger, right? And she was like, yeah, for y'all, not for us. We ain't have the good, we ain't have all of this good old glory days. And that really, really, really hit me. It stuck with me.
Once again, the National Public Housing Museum thanks you for listening to this special Black History Month episode of Out of the Archives. This series is supported by the Illinois Art Council Agency, the Kresge Foundation, the Andrew W. Mellon Foundation, and the Department of Cultural Affairs and Special Events. This episode was engineered by Seth Engel. We'd like to give a huge thanks to our storytellers, Jayah Arnett, Bonnette Bryant, Domingo Morales, and Pamela Phillips. All the stories in this episode were recorded by me, Shakir Johnson. We're also thrilled to include the podcast's new theme song, Born in the Blues, which was written, played, and recorded by Keith Hudson, a former resident of Chicago's Stateway Gardens. Thank you again for listening, and we look forward to sharing more stories with you soon.